Can I be vulnerable with you? I had a really deep experience recently that took me by surprise. And when I started discussing it with friends, I realized I wasn't the only one. It was the day after the election in the US, and I had woken up expecting that we might not know the results of the election yet. So you can imagine my surprise when I saw that the race had already been called. However, that's not all that I saw. I saw news panelists who had been civil the night before start to argue as they attempted to break down what had happened. So I turned off the TV and later came online and immediately started to see reports of people being taunted or harassed, and some fearing for their safety as a result of the election. I started to feel this overwhelming sense of sadness come over me, and I started to cry. Except I couldn't stop. I started to cry harder, unable to explain myself why this was happening. The crying felt deep and turned into sobbing, and I began to feel as if something was working its way out through me. After about an hour, I was able to get up, but felt like I was in a daze. Now, to be honest, I'm not a super emotional person. I tend towards the intellectual side. So that's why this felt so out of character for me. The pain didn't feel like it was mine, as in my personal grief. Yet it was a very embodied experience that felt like it had to come through. There's no other way for me to describe it than to say it felt like our collective pain was channeling through me. As I mentioned, once I started sharing this experience, I realized that others had the same experiences of great grief and corresponding anxiety or even rage that didn't feel like it was their own. This came from people of all genders, inside and outside the US, but interestingly, all within the same window of time that day. I wondered what on earth was happening. It feels like something big, and while I don't have all the answers, I do feel this is something we're stepping into collectively. So in this video, I'd like to share with you what unfolded for me in my research the days after this experience, and perhaps some of the themes of what we can expect, as well as what may be asked of us as a result. My name is Christina Montsma, and I enjoy diving into astrology, history, and psychology to help guide humanity through its seasons. But I'll admit, this video isn't your typical stuff, as I'm going to share with you the idea of Sabian grand trines and retrogrades, the South African apartheid, and a researcher who studied vulnerability. But my hope is that if you stick with me and consider what these upcoming transits are asking of you, you might come out the other side with a new perspective. A few days after the experience I just shared with you, I was going over some of the upcoming transits, and I noticed something. 3 retrogrades happening in succession at the same degree of the 3 fire signs. This felt like this might not be a coincidence, and there was something telling me to look up the corresponding Sabian symbols for the degrees. My hunch was that there was a message there about where we are collectively and where we're headed. Now, to be clear, I'm not personally aware that the idea I'm about to present to you has been established or researched. So think about it and do with it what you will. Or if it has, please let me know in the comments. I will say that it didn't even occur to me at the time that I just had an experience where I felt like collective grief had come through me. And I was about to dive into an astrological tool that was also channeled from a collective source. For those who aren't familiar, Sabian symbols were discovered by astrologer Mark Edmund Jones and medium Elsie Wheeler in 1925. The goal of the experiment, as Jones called it, was to tap into an ancient wisdom that used imagery to describe the energy of each of the 360 degrees of the zodiac. Jones believed this wisdom came from the ancient Sabian tribe, who were Hermetic alchemists in Mesopotamia, the birthplace of astrology as we know it today. But Jones is also known to have used the idea of harmonics to explain the essence of aspects in astrology. I recently took some time to familiarize myself with this while studying aspect patterns, and it really boils down to basic math and the essence of root numbers. For example, when you divide a perfect circle by 1, you get the essence of oneness, wholeness, merging, or unification. This is essentially what a conjunction is. When you divide a circle by 2, you get a splitting of oneness into polarity, which is represented by the opposition. When you divide a circle by 3, you get the essence of creativity, which leads to synthesis. This is represented by the trine. And when you divide a circle by 4, you get what he called matter made manifest, and the inability to give way, or a square aspect. Given Jones' understanding of esoteric knowledge, I began to wonder about how these ideas might intersect. Essentially, if the Sabian symbols are a representation of a specific point within a perfect 360-degree circle, this would suggest that different symbols would harmonize with other symbols in the circle, just like aspects do. For example, take a grand trine. A grand trine is created by dividing a circle exactly into 3, resulting in 3 segments that are the same distance apart and land roughly on the same numbered degrees. They also land in the same element. Take a grand fire trine with one corner of the triangle at about 1 degree Aries, 1 degree Leo, and 1 degree Sagittarius, the 3 fire signs. Fire signs represent inspiration, the spark of life, meaning or purpose, and the spiritual dimension. When you pair that with the grand trine, you infuse the essence of 3ness, or creativity, which leads to synthesis, into inspiration, spirituality, etc. After following this idea, I came across Dane Rudyard's book with a ridiculously elongated title, An Astrological Mandala, The Cycle of Transformations and Its 360 Symbolic Phases, a reinterpretation of the Sabian symbols, presenting them as a contemporary American I Ching. While Rudyard didn't appear to make the direct connection I was following, he explored similar concepts that further merged the meaning of signs and the Sabian symbols. For example, he stated that trines bring out the full manifestation of what he calls one of the 4 modalities of power, or the 4 elements. He explains that power is generated in the cardinal sign, concentrated in the fixed sign, and distributed in the mutable sign. When it comes to the element of fire specifically, he suggests that it represents power that is released at the start of a new cycle. Aries generates new potentialities of existence. Leo concentrates that potentiality and makes it individual and personalized. And Sagittarius distributes these new individual identities and, in the process, sustains and expands civilization, as well as energizing the way we engage one another. So going back to the idea of grand fire trine Sabian symbols, this could suggest that when they're activated, either together or in sequence, symbols at the same degree of the fire signs give us a picture of how our identity, inspiration, sense of meaning, and spiritual connection are created, concentrated, and distributed. Now, before I share the transits and Sabian symbols that caught my eye, I need to bring up one other thing. All 3 transits were in retrograde motion, or going backwards from their usual path as seen from Earth. Retrograde periods bring a retracing of one's steps or rethinking one's decisions in order to consider a different perspective. So while these 3 transits all contribute to an energy of initiation of a fiery concept, they're all in a reflective stance, suggesting that something that was already created is now being revised and recreated. Astrology.com has an excellent write-up on retrogrades where I found another great point about them. Retrogrades are a side effect of speed and a planet's proximity to the Earth, specifically being at its closest point to Earth. The author suggests that perhaps any problems we perceive during retrogrades are at least somewhat due to being too close to someone or something to see it objectively. So by doing the things a retrograde represents, like taking our time, getting some distance from a situation, and rethinking one's stance, we see things that we couldn't see before because we've gained perspective. I'll bring this point back later. Now, for the transits. The first transit I noticed was the North Node, retrograding through the 6th degree of Aries from August 30th all the way up to November 5th, the day of the election in the US. For those of you who know astrology, you might say, but the North Node is always retrograding. This is more or less true. And within this context, I think that's okay, as the nodes ask us to revisit past patterns or lessons in order to promote growth. For Sabian symbols, you always round the degree and minutes up to the nearest degree. So any planet at 6 degrees and between 1 and 59 minutes, we will want to round up to 7 degrees. The Sabian symbol for 7 degrees of Aries is a person successfully expressing themselves in 2 realms at once. I'm not going to lie, I really had to chew on this symbol for a while. The 2 realms part of this symbol perplexed me a bit until I looked at the symbol on the opposite side of the zodiac for 7 degrees of Libra, which says, a woman feeding chickens and protecting them from the hawks. For me, both of these symbols suggest a material or physical realm, as well as a spiritual or immaterial realm. Once I made this connection, a person successfully expressing themselves in 2 realms at once reminded me of how Neo in the Matrix learned how to move around in both the physical real world and the computer-generated matrix or unseen world. But he was only able to do this once he made a choice to become aware of it. For this symbol, Rudyard suggests that we need to develop the ability to operate at both the spiritual and material levels. But in order to do this, we need to understand what's going on underneath the surface and bring it into reality or awareness. So in regards to the experience I had, that begs the question, what's actually going on here? Is this just about politics? I found it interesting that on November 5th, the final day of the North Node in this degree, we were also experiencing 2 contrasting oppositions, Venus opposite Jupiter and Mars opposite Pluto. In this context, Venus and Mars can be said to represent the more physical side of life, whereas in comparison, Jupiter and Pluto represent the more spiritual side. There was a tension in the collective that certainly represented 2 contrasting polarities that needed to be navigated successfully at once. For example, on the one hand, US citizens were voting about women's rights over their bodies, Venus. And on the other hand, they were also voting about how far the law, Jupiter, should go to regulate this. We were also engaging contentious topics that not only riled people's passionate views, Mars, but also touched on power and control of those issues, Pluto. We were voting for male and female candidates on a ballot, but we were also revisiting and rethinking our beliefs and our identity as a nation, which has been undergoing a transformation. The following day, November 6th, was the day that felt like grieving. It felt like something that had micro fractures was now cracking apart completely, which is what made the next symbol I looked up so significant. On November 7th, Mercury entered its shadow period at 6 degrees and 23 minutes Sagittarius. A shadow period is essentially the ground you're going to go back over later. It's as if you've dropped your keys at the moment the shadow period begins, but you don't know you've lost your keys yet, so you continue on your journey. At some point though, you do realize you've lost your keys, so you stop and turn around to retrace your steps. Turning around is the start of the retrograde, which happens on November 25th for Mercury. It will take until December 15th to get all the way back to the point where the keys were lost, at which point you pick them up and continue forward again, covering the same ground a third and final time, now with your keys in hand. The Sabian symbol for 7 degrees of Sagittarius is Cupid knocking at the door of a human heart. Now, when I read that after what I had just experienced, I was floored. The door Cupid is knocking on is a barrier around the heart, keeping love out. But for how long? Rudyard comments on 7 degrees of Sag, saying, intensely romantic love knows no rules and ignores collective purpose or dictates of reason. Yet it may bring to the individual an intensity of feeling which no group togetherness can arouse, at least at the ordinary social level. What is implied is a challenge to emotional rebirth. I'd like to suggest that when we stepped into this Mercury shadow period on November 7th, it's as if Cupid began knocking, stirring up emotions at the door of our hearts. And while you can ignore someone's knocking for a short while, at some point, if the person at the door is persistent, you have to make a decision to go and answer it. Now, during that whole process of Cupid knocking at the door and deciding whether or not to answer him, there's a third retrograde, and that's Mars at 6 degrees and 10 minutes of Leo on December 6th. The Sabian symbol for 7 degrees of Leo is the wonder of the constellations of stars in the night sky. As an astrologer, I love this symbol, and Rudyard has some lovely things to say about it as well, which essentially boiled down to constellations representing the power of basic spiritual values, which refer to man's common humanity. There's something about the permanence of spiritual truths amidst our impermanent lives, which have existed since the beginning of time. We may find ourselves in a chaotic place where everything is changing, but time offers us perspective about what is truly important. If the rhythm of the stars tells us that everything that has been will be, it certainly encourages us to zoom out and consider how important are the reasons we have for keeping the door to our hearts closed. It also encourages us to reorient ourselves to the truths that have survived the eternal turning of time. Mars will be retracing its steps just like Mercury and will return 5 months later to this point on May 2nd, 2025. What actions will ultimately get us what we want? Fighting, hiding, or opening the door to connection? It's a scary place to be, but as Rudyard suggested about Cupid, the intensity of romantic love can't be compared to group togetherness. In other words, we may be able to come to consensus about what's best for all, but the reason we decide to even open the door is first of all personal. Oftentimes a specific person or a specific experience with deep meaning that convinces us to take a risk. After all, both revolutions like Katniss Everdeen and the Hunger Games, and conflicts like the Trojan War, were started because of the love of one person for another. In an attempt to step back and gain some perspective about everything that had happened and how others have handled tumultuous times like this before, I reached out to a friend of mine and asked if she'd be willing to share about her experience growing up in South Africa in the 80s and 90s at the end of apartheid. And Nicole, I just have to say a big thanks for sharing your story and your time with me to talk about such a powerful topic, both on a personal and collective level. Nicole shared with me a number of experiences both before and after the official end of apartheid on April 27th, 1994, which I'd like to point out was when Saturn was around the same degree in Pisces as it just was during our November 5th election, 30 years later, stationing from its retrograde to turn direct. Some experiences she shared included the censorship that happened before the end of apartheid. Peaceful portrayals of the country were placed on the 3 or 4 national TV channels, keeping the greater public blind to the activism and protests happening. Mandela was declared a terrorist. Yet there were moments when things seemed to start to crack. She shared an instance when an anti-apartheid song, Something Inside So Strong, became wildly popular, despite the fact that anything referencing the apartheid wasn't supposed to be aired. She also shared about seeing the long lines of people in the 1994, the first of which allowed everyone to vote. And she also shared about the sense of hope that people had in the years following, particularly in 1995, when Archbishop Desmond Tutu led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But what caught my attention the most was when she shared that what made the difference at that time and turned the tide on a social level were leaders who were truly open-hearted and vulnerable. They weren't just playing a role. They were actually sharing their hearts, and this made a big impact on the people, more than any policy or law. Of course, a lot of what the government came up with at that time was idealistic, but didn't necessarily come true. For example, there were plans to give people small homes, but this didn't actualize, and a period of disengagement happened. However, she shared something else that I found equally valuable. She said that after leaving the country, she returned for regular visits and started to see progress in the local community. Essentially, the people who once had hope in the government, but were then disillusioned by the lack of follow-through, had decided to take matters into their own hands at the local level. Within their micro-communities, they came together to meet each other's needs, including building homes for those who were promised ones, except bigger and with enough space for a family to thrive. What I heard my friend describe was the people in the community taking their power back and resolving the division on a local level instead of relying or waiting on someone else to do this for them. And while one community couldn't provide for the whole nation, it turned out that they could provide for their neighbors in a way that the government wouldn't have anyways. The open-heartedness and vulnerability that had started out with the example of just a few ultimately continued on the local level once the people took ownership for their own open-heartedness and vulnerability with their neighbors. But this caught my attention for another reason, as just the day before, I was reminded of the work of Brené Brown, a qualitative researcher and storyteller whose breakthrough TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, became wildly successful and changed our perspective and perception of human connection. In that talk, she shared something very similar about open-heartedness and vulnerability to what I had heard my friend Nicole describe in action in South Africa. I'll include the link to that TED Talk in the description box below if you're interested. In a nutshell, after interviewing thousands of people and stepping back to analyze her data, she realized something important about connection. The opposite of connection is shame. But how did she come to this conclusion? She shared that shame is when I fear that there's something about me which if people find out about it, they would reject me. So shame serves as an attempt to prevent disconnection or rejection by not revealing the ugly stuff. The problem is that in order for connection to happen, we have to be wholly seen. So when we hide parts of ourselves, we're actually cutting off the possibility of true connection. She also shared that when she went back over the thousands of interviews she had performed, she found there was only one thing that separated those with a sense of love and belonging or connection to others, and those without a sense of love and belonging, and it was this. They believed they were worthy of love and belonging. That's all that made the difference. So how then do we believe we are worthy of love and belonging, particularly if we've lived a lifetime of not believing that? What are the characteristics that lead us there? Brown identified 4 things this group had in common that separated them from the rest. Number 1 is courage, but not the kind of courage you're thinking of. She stated this is the courage to be imperfect and let people see that. There's one other thing Nicole shared about the years of healing after apartheid that was immensely helpful, and that was humor, specifically the ability to laugh about their imperfections. It can feel really hard to admit how imperfect we are, but sometimes a little humor goes a long way to help walk through this courageous path. Number 2 is compassion, but not towards others, towards oneself first. Because as it turns out, we can only have compassion for others as far as we have compassion for ourselves. Number 3 is authenticity, which points us back to courage. And number 4 is that they fully embraced vulnerability, which wasn't something excruciating like it was for the group who did not feel a sense of love and belonging. It was just a necessary thing to get to the experience of love and belonging. Now I realize this is a lot to pull together, so let me return to the retrograde fire trine we're in the midst of. I'd like to suggest that we have an identity, both collective and personal, that needs to be reviewed and recreated. And if this feels beyond possible, perhaps we need to consider that we're too close to see it objectively. I'd also like to suggest that there's nothing wrong with becoming immersed with the material, tangible, or practical day-to-day life, because they matter. But are we losing perspective of the spiritual and valuing a higher love? What's really going on underneath the surface? Is this really about immigration policies? Or is it about how we're treating newcomers in our communities? Next, I would ask, do we want something more? Do we want a relationship with our neighbor, or do we want to be considered right, arms crossed behind closed doors? Are we willing to be the one who will have the courage to risk opening ourselves up and to be vulnerable in hopes of experiencing love and belonging? And if someone is already knocking on our door, will we have the compassion to see our own imperfections and forgive ourselves so that we can do the same for others? Finally, I would like to ask, are we people that believe we're worthy of love and belonging? Do our actions demonstrate that we believe that? If not, perhaps we're being invited to revise and recreate that identity and sense of purpose. We may not be perfect, but can we be authentic instead? If I had to pick one thing that this experience has shown me, it's that one act of open-heartedness and vulnerability could inspire hundreds. But even more importantly, it could transform your relationship with just a few. starting with yourself. Remember, there's a time for vulnerability.